I'm Soledad O'Brien. Welcome to Matter of Fact. A war over DACA is being waged in the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's pitting Republicans against each other. A group of renegade Republican Congress members are trying to force a vote on a series of immigration bills that would protect so-called dreamers, those undocumented immigrants brought to the United States as children. They're using what's called a discharge petition to bypass Republican leadership and move directly to a vote on 4 different proposals. Whichever bill gets the most votes would be sent on to the Senate. It's known as a Queen of the Hill vote. A discharge petition requires the approval of the majority of members to pass, and assuming all the Democrats sign on, the Republicans would need 25 members to agree. House Speaker Paul Ryan and the Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, are urging Republicans to not support the move. Ryan says the discharge petition is a big mistake, causes disunity in the party, and that none of the bills have a chance of becoming law. But the Republicans who have signed the petition say they're frustrated that Ryan hasn't taken any action on immigration. Congressman Will Hurd represents the 23rd District of Texas. He was one of the very first Republicans to sign the petition. His immigration proposal, which is called the USA Act, is one of the bills set to be voted on if the petition passes. Congressman, it's so nice to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's step back for a second and just talk about the big picture of immigration as we look toward the midterm elections. On one hand, you have Republicans like yourself for whom your reelection could well rely on Latinos going to the polls. On the other hand, there is a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment that's been whipped up as well. What's your biggest concern as these two forces sort of collide for the outcome of the midterm elections?
Well, I actually believe that there's not one issue that makes or breaks an election. My election in November is based on my last 13 months of providing leadership to the district, helping out constituents, and solving problems. And one of those problems that needs to be solved is actually immigration. Also, when you look at the macroeconomic issues going on in our country, we're at 3.9% unemployment. What does that mean? That means that it's really hard to find good employees. And when it comes to these DACA kids, over 1 million of them, that 97% of them are in school or are working. 5% of them are entrepreneurs, which is more than twice the national average. These are young men and women that are already contributing to our culture, our history, our economy. And these are folks that we need. And so we should be making sure that they have a permanent legislative fix for their situation.
The president said recently, we have people coming into the country or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people, they are animals. Right? He's talking about undocumented people flowing into the country. How problematic is calling undocumented people not humans, but animals?
I don't talk about them that way. And also, that is not a perspective that all Republicans share. And that's why we're working to try to solve this problem.
I mentioned the Queen of the Hill rule, and one of the bills that, if in fact that passed, would be yours. Give me the short version of what your bill has in it.
It's called the USA Act. Simple. Smart wall. Look at all 2,000 miles of the border at the same time. Let's be deploying technology. Technology exists that we can tell the difference between a bunny rabbit and a person. So let's actually secure our border. And it's a fraction of the cost of building a concrete structure along the entire mile of the border. Then you have a DACA fix for over 1 million young men and women. It's a permanent legislative fix, and it gives a pathway to legal status. Third piece is additional immigration judges. One of the problems that you have with the number of folks that have been apprehended, you can't get them through the legal system fast enough. And then a fourth piece, which is let's work on rule of law and economic development opportunities in the places that people are having to leave. Those are the 4 elements.
Why does Paul Ryan not bring any of these bills to the floor?
I don't understand why. I think he has said that he believes that the president wouldn't sign some of these bills, that it wouldn't become law. Well, our job in Congress is to negotiate pieces of legislation. And guess what? It's the president's, it's his right to veto a bill or to sign a bill. And so let's have that process work. I actually believe that if we get a bipartisan solution to the president's desk, he will sign it.
Congressman Will Hurd, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.